Well, thank you so much for the welcome, and of course to the front team for putting on this fantastic event. I mean, look at this venue. It's beautiful, right? So I'm really humbled to be here, super excited. But really quick before we dive in, I want to set your expectations a little bit because my talk here is going to be a little bit unorthodox for a design conference. And I don't know if Ben's out there, but he's probably going to kill me. I'm sorry, Ben. Don't kill me, man. Thanks. I appreciate the support. So what that means is you're not going to see any product screens. You won't see any growth charts. But what you will see are some people and some places that will serve as like visual markers along the way. So I'm going to put myself out there a little bit and give you the sausage factory tour, if you will. I'll share a few stories from my past, some for the first time here. And so I'll sort of connect my past to my present day. But the bigger point is this. We all have a personal history, right? It's complete with, the victories and the struggles that hopefully teach us how to better navigate, our lives. And to be sure, for me, learning about other people's journeys has actually given me the courage to evolve, right? And help me feel a little bit more connected as I've walked my own path. So I hope what I share with you today will pass some new insights forward and perhaps move some of you to action, to represent and also speak your truth. So that's my overall goal for today and my call to action for you. So my story is about growing up second-generation American, and that's Korean American specifically. And generation definitions, it varies depending on who you talk to, but for the purposes of today, I mean second generation to be children born here in the US to parents that immigrated from another country. So I'll be sharing my upbringing and how it shaped my worldview, but also how I've learned that my personal truth could be a tremendous source of strength and wisdom across a range of contexts. And so I'll be describing my experience in 3 parts, kind of like vignettes, and think of them like chapters in a book. Chapter 1, the costs of comfort. So in the first grade, I'd shuffle over to the Bayshore Community Church, which is pictured here on your left, for after-school activities, and I'd stay there until about 4 o'clock. And then I'd walk over to my parents' small business, which was the small liquor store was about 5 blocks away. And so I'd hang out there, keep my mom company as she worked, and that's the actual marquee there, the liquor locker. And I like to play in the aisles. My favorite thing to do was to hang out in the back of the walk-in refrigerator and like heckle the patrons from the back, I was like, don't take the beer, you want the milk. And so I'd kind of play around out there until my dad would arrive to relieve my mom a little bit later in the afternoon. And one day, I was running between the stock area and the walk-in, and I heard a man shouting. And then my mom responding, and then this sort of volleyed exchange, like building to this harsh and sudden non sequitur. Hey, why don't you just go back to your country? And just as quickly as that escalated, the man was shown the door, and it was all over. But that incident, it always stuck with me. It was the first time that I'd seen my parents like verbally assaulted in that way, but it was also my very first memory of feeling that, that bitter slurry of anger and confusion and shame that kind of wells up in you when someone's out there to rob you of your dignity. So it was a cheap shot. The obvious intent being to marginalize and to shut down. And for what? To haggle over a bag of chips or whatever it was. So as years went by, this regular pattern that was fraught with confrontation began to emerge. From the verbal attacks to theft and burglary, armed robbery, fights, you name it, it happened over the 40 years my parents ran that place. So then, why take the risks of running a liquor store? Well, it's actually a very common way for first-generation immigrants to put food on the table and establish, some kind of a baseline for their family. And if you think about it, they arrive here with not a whole lot of resources. They probably don't have a ton of financial backstops. And then you pile on the cultural and the language barriers, and it's going to be kind of a rocky road. But, if you have your health and you can withstand a little bit of dirt under your fingernails, then you can stand up a manageably sized enterprise like a gas station or a laundromat, or in our case, a liquor store. And it's not about, you're not chasing some lifelong passion here. You're just doing this to provide. The truth is, liquor stores are very dangerous, and they're cash-based primarily, and that makes you a target. My dad's best friend and my Uncle Yang both owned liquor stores in LA at the same time my parents did. Both lost their lives to the violence that constantly threatens these businesses. So our first-generation guardians, they put aside their own aspirations in order to establish a softer landing for the next. And in doing so, I think they were setting our trajectory, maybe just a degree or so higher than their own, so that we might have the opportunity to put down roots and maybe be the first to generate some kind of legacy here. Simon Sinek says, leadership comes at a cost, and what that cost is, it's self-interest. And so their sacrifice kind of enabled this higher order fulfillment, right? And I'm just talking about simple things like being able to have a basic level of comfort in your life. One outcome of that comfort, and this is a benefit that I gained from my parents' hardscrabble diligence in this neighborhood business, was that I didn't have to go into the neighborhood business, right? I was free to wait tables or be a failure as an environmental scientist and then wander the country wondering, what the heck else am I going to do? And when I eventually found my calling as a designer, I didn't have to face the same aggression or the same risks that my parents did, right? So instead, I get to apply their lessons in my current role, establish that softer landing for my design teams, and ensure that they'll also be set up to thrive and perhaps be comfortable in their day-to-day as well. At Lyft, I once had the difficult task of guiding my team through a jarring org change following the sudden departure of the previous VP. And to give you a little bit of context, in the year leading up to that change, we had instituted this centralized studio model, which I'm sure many of the designers here are familiar with. And this came with the benefits of a design-led process. We had more investment. We had this beautiful custom-built studio just for us. And we had this open charter from the company to create trajectory for Lyft. This is blue sky territory, and we were super excited. This was like a dream for us. And we assumed that design was going to be leading innovation for the company and blazing trails for every other team, every other product team to follow, right? Except it didn't really pan out. We were producing high-quality artifacts and truly inspired work, but we had isolated ourselves from the rest of the company. And not just physically, but culturally and collaboratively. So that ended up trapping much of the work that we were doing inside the studio walls. As a result, resentment sprouted from our cross-functional teams, communication broke down, and within a year, productivity had diminished significantly, kind of to a slow and a bit painful drip. By this point, design was a pariah. People were posting brutal memes on Blind, the anonymous social network, and it got real bad for a while. And so the situation finally came to a head, and new leadership had to be appointed. Yeah, and so just the previous night, I had dinner with the founders, and they asked me to take over and turn things around. And I was like, okay, I'll try, you know. And then they announced the changes the next morning, and off we went. And so as the interim VP, acknowledging the sins of the past was definitely a big part of the transition, but just as important was going to be the change management. Because, you know, if I were to just undo everything that we'd put in place over the past year, I might lose half the team. There was much to like if you were on the design team, right? You know, and many of us had grown accustomed to the benefits and the accoutrements. But on the other hand, if my changes were not sufficiently aggressive, my cross-functional partners would just remain, they'd stay unsatisfied, and they're going to re-escalate the issues, and we'd be back to square one. So I was a little bit frustrated by this seemingly impossible challenge to reach a perfect balance of compromise and concession for design team versus other teams, you know. So I was like, okay, I'm going to take a step back here and independently act to reset the culture and think about productivity overall, holistically. So we had to drop the studio model for one. It just was not a good fit for Lyft at the scale. And then both sides had to change their attitudes towards partnership. And so this meant delivering some pretty unpopular decisions to both my team and my partners in favor, again, of overall alignment and broader operational health. And to be honest, this aspect of the role, I mean, I fully recognize that it was a huge privilege, but it was not enjoyable. It was not at all fun. And in the middle of it all, I have to admit that I considered pulling the plug like more than once. But then I thought about my parents and my Uncle Yang and the lessons from the liquor store, and I thought, you know, if there ever was a moment to step up as a leader in my role, I think this was going to be it. You know, I had this unique opportunity to step into the ring and face these challenges head on and at least make an attempt, right, to make some sense of the chaos. Yeah, it'd be hard. Okay, it's not going to be fun. But at this point, it was my role to step out in front and prepare a healthier framework for my team, just as my parents had done for me and my sisters. In describing leadership expectations, I really like the way Julie Zhou distills this responsibility by asking, are you willing to do what your team needs you to do? And I think it's a very simple but provocative challenge. And while I may have paid the cost in comfort in my role, and maybe lost a few sentiment points between my team and my partners, the truth is we withstood the low points. Productivity bounced back, those snarky memes went away, and now the team was poised for reinvention. And so we experienced real transformation. And to me, that was a huge victory, right? Okay, but then what about people? And what about connection? And so that's something I'll talk about in chapter 2. I call it Mom to the People, but it's really about why relationships matter. So there was a constant stream of activity at the liquor store, and it's a tight little space, and you got customers, and my parents helping the customers, delivery guys, and all the riffraff squeezing past each other. And a lot of people would find this constant people contact, you know, uncomfortable and exhausting. But my mom, she loved it. She thrived on it. And that was fitting because, you know, liquor stores are inherently people-centric. I mean, they're on you all day long. And in order to run a healthy business, you have to have some kind of a harmony in place across all these relationships. And so on the best days, business goes as the neighborhood goes. And one particularly important relationship grew a little bit behind the scenes between my mom and the store's landlord, Mrs. P. And to give you a little context there, the store is located on 2nd Street, which is prime real estate on the main commerce strip in Belmont Shore. And so well out of reach for us to have owned financially, so we paid rent. And my mom would drive over to Mrs. P's home every month, and she would hand deliver the check in a clean white envelope, and on every holiday it would be accompanied by a gift. And then Mrs. P, in turn, would invite my mom inside, and the two of them would sit down over a cup of coffee. They'd talk about their kids, their health, how the business was doing, as good friends might do. And this went on every month for 40 years. See, my mom needs to have understanding and trust to be present in her life. And that trust was a key component of, and the basis, really, of their friendship. Make no mistake, Mrs. P was a shrewd businesswoman, right? But she wasn't greedy. And the rent would go up, over the years, but it went up at a pace that we could keep up with. And then my mom always honored her end of the bargain, never missing a payment, even when the neighborhood wouldn't cooperate. So pragmatically, this relationship had a direct impact on our family's livelihood. If the rent's too high, the margins are too thin, less goes home to provide. Left to pure market conditions, small businesses like ours, there's no leverage there, right? So relationships and the people in your life matter the most. So after 480 rent checks paid, Mom finally decided it's time to hang it up. She'd had enough. And the simple plan was to sell the business. And because we didn't own the place, that meant the licenses, the inventory, the equipment, and ideally, it would all be wrapped up in a freshly renewed long-term lease. And that last piece is critical because you have to leave enough meat on the bone for the next owner to be able to onboard, but also establish their vision for the store. So we got the ball rolling, and we had this super enthusiastic buyer, Mr. Lee here, not the guy with the red beard, who was my mom's right hand of several years. Good dude, a hard worker, a friend, so naturally they wanted to pass him the torch. And Mr. Lee was also a first-generation immigrant from Korea, and he'd scraped up the money to become an owner, just as my parents had done 40 years prior. And so now it was his turn to kind of step into that provider role for his family and realize his American dream. And just as we were finalizing the deal, Mrs. P's health started to decline. And as her condition worsened, that's when you saw the vultures start to circle. Mrs. P's daughter, a school principal that lived many miles away from Long Beach, after a curt introduction over email, demanded that we, stop the process. She wanted to revisit the terms, run her own background checks, re-inspect, reappraise. And she made her intentions very clear. She was here to take over the estate, liquidate the assets, rake the proceeds, and do so with as little friction as possible. And of course, she knew her mother was sick. But in her final days, Mrs. P gathered the strength and imposed her position as family boss, and she stood up for us. And she actually battled her own children to negotiate favorable terms on our behalf and ultimately rescued the deal. And then later that year, Mrs. P passed away. So she truly saved my parents' little nest egg. And while it wasn't much, this deal represented the entirety of their retirement. So had they not been able to sell, they would have been left with just shreds of the business, a ton of financial debt, and without a long-term runway, no space to operate, they would have effectively had a dead-end business in their hands. So our fortunate outcome was built on the bedrock of human connection. Mom showed us that being engaged and invested in these meaningful partnerships was just the right thing to do. You do your best to understand people and help them when you can, and one day when you need some help, they just might reach out, like Mrs. P did for us. So people really matter. Relationships and human connection as a result have become first principles in my day-to-day. And throughout my career, trusting partnerships have meant far more to any success or well-being than any overt status symbol like a title or a promotion. People have always mattered so much more. Strong relationships also make you a better manager. Feedback conversations will land way better if you've invested real energy in building trust, and your team will be much more open with their needs as a result. And as we saw in my previous story about the design studio, we know how things can go sour when communication breaks down and partnerships go away. So relationships really matter. And so does the way you show up in these relationships, right? Which brings me to chapter 3, finding strength in your differences. And this is about my quest for belonging. In his book, L.A. Sun, Roy Choi talks about the double life of growing up Asian American and his experience around the food in his home and people in his life. And I don't know if there's any second-gen Koreans in the audience out there. Oh, okay. It's more than I expected. So if you're out, so you've lived a version of this story. And what Chef Roy is talking about is the fact that many Korean households have 2 refrigerators. One is for kimchi and other impossibly pungent food, and the second fridge is for everything else. And let's say you have an unwitting friend over, you might go to the wrong fridge to grab a soda, and once they do, they'll be served a fierce blast of fermented kimchi air, straight to the face. And they'll be blown back, hair all blown back. They will have forgotten the soda because they dropped it out of shock. And just like that, you're the kid with the smelly food at home, right? And it doesn't really seem like a big deal, but you ask any first or second generation Asian American, and you'll find that many dealt with that same stigma and felt self-conscious about it, right? I know I did. And so, again, for a little context, I was raised in Belmont Shore. This is a small West Coast beachy vibe town. Just 45 minutes to the north, droves of Korean expats were settling what's now famously known as Koreatown in LA. In Belmont Shore, however, we were it. We definitely stood out. And that was a little bit inconvenient because I naturally wanted to fit in. But kids are kids. Sometimes they're mean, right? Plus, I saw how my parents were sometimes mistreated and stereotyped at the liquor store, so I was motivated by social pressure, and therefore I sought the path of assimilation. I would go out of my way to actively repress any outward expression of my culture. I didn't want to be seen as other. I didn't want to be known as smelly food kid number 3, So what did I do? I enthusiastically adopted the attributes of the dominant culture around me. I spent a lot of energy perfecting my code switching skills. Somehow I gravitated toward a group of Caucasian beach kids and water polo players, and I could neither surf nor swim for long periods of time, but these were the choices that I made. And I was accepted, and I, by the way, have no regrets. I have no regrets. In fact, all of us here in this photo remain very close friends after 25 years. Brene Brown, a well-known researcher, a research professor, defines fitting in as the greatest barrier, actually, to belonging. And so she asserts that belonging doesn't require us to change who we are, it requires us to be who we are. And I actually agree with that. But I'd also argue that it takes years of work and some level of maturity to build that courage and that self-acceptance, which I didn't have much of in my formative years. It's true, my social strategy was based on fitting in, but my natural disposition was in fact to, seek that belonging, to find sameness and figure out how we're more alike than how we're different. And that's how I built my friendships. Thankfully, I didn't completely betray my roots. My family made sure of that. To this day, we celebrate New Year's Day at my parents' house, which is something we've been doing for decades. And it's an occasion to pay respects to our elders. We trade notes with our cousins and learn a little bit more about our Korean traditions. And these critical family ties, while I hid them at times, kept my culture alive in me. And that's my life too. I just didn't want my 2 worlds to collide. But as I grew up, I got wiser, and Barack Obama describes his upbringing as this progression of, shedding fear. And I think that simple insight also neatly describes my evolution. My insecurities dissolved as I racked up years of life. I learned to reconcile my assimilating tendencies, but most importantly, recognize the strength in my differences. And with that psychological freedom, you gain the capacity for new thoughts and to develop point of view, right? Decide the things in life that you want to stand for. For me, that's family, that's connection, and that's creating some kind of value in the world. I recently started a new job at Google, overseeing design for Gmail and the other communication apps within G Suite. So it's an ambitious role, huge scope, billions of users worldwide. And I was lucky enough to inherit a high-performing team, along with a set of incredibly sharp and long-tenured partners. So it was all a bit intimidating, to be honest. So as I was onboarding, I was anxious to make an immediate impression. I was like, dude, Frank, find a way to show impact, man, as soon as possible, right? And this is a mindset that was drilled in me. I was conditioned to embrace in my 7-year crucible at Lyft, which is like a fast-paced startup. But as I settled in, I started getting to know my teammates. I realized that this was not going to be one of those gigs where you burst onto the scene and within 90 days you're flipping tables and overtaking the helm. That might fly at a growing startup, but at Google, good luck with that. So with that, it's a good meme, so I'm sure you've seen it a few times. So Google, it was also a dominant culture of sorts, right? And my first instinct was to relapse and, do the Homer, disappear, find a way to quietly catch up, basically, and fit in. But then I was like, this doesn't feel right, Well, the first thing is, the operational culture at Google is an incredibly unique and complex soup, I will say. And catching up to people that have years and years of deep product expertise and a keen understanding of all the nuanced, organizational and political, the nuances there, that was going to take forever. And if I'm always behind, it's really hard to add value. I got the reverse here. So I sought the advice of my manager, and I was reminded that I was hired for a reason, right? And I channeled some Barack and some Brene, shed the fear, own my story, right? I clearly see things that we should consider changing. I bring unique experience to the role, and I have real value to share. I just need to articulate the things I want to stand for and make those expectations super clear to my partners and my team. So this is ongoing work for me, and it describes what I'm doing today to embrace the strength in my differences and to also continue evolving as a partner and a leader. And it's early to report on any results, but regardless of any future outcome, I could say today, I feel like a much truer version of myself at work. And indeed, I do feel like I could belong. And so in closing, I hope some parts of my story resonated with you. Even though your experience will be unique and personal, perhaps you'll recognize a similar theme or two, and in the process find strength in your differences. And should you find them, I hope you'll share them too. Because here's the thing, we don't hear enough stories of difference, right? And this is a personal statistic that puts representation in perspective for me. Of my last 20 managers since I've been a designer, 2 have looked like me. Of all the CEOs I've ever worked for, there's only been 1. In both cases, that is a whopping 10%. In a 2015 study by the Ascend Foundation reports that Asian Americans were least likely of all races to become managers or executives in tech, despite having some of the strongest representation in the field. And I think these results are telling. And basically what they tell me is, I think we could do better than 10%, right? So today, I'm raising my voice, but the point is, we need more representatives to be out there speaking their truth and being visible. I'm hopeful because there are pioneers making waves, like Roy Choi. He's an innovative chef, a community advocate. Margaret Lee, she's my mentor and friend, design leader at Google. My cousin Billy Yang, he's an athlete and a filmmaker and keeper of his father's legacy, my Uncle Yang. Yet this is only, again, one facet one segment, and we know there are countless others. So the more underrepresented voices we elevate, the louder the noise, and the further the reach. And the more likely we'll be able to see meaningful change towards inclusion in all roles, but more importantly, at all levels. And if we continue this work and keep building that momentum, I think a good start would be all the people here in this theater. I think that would be a pretty great thing. So that's all I got. Thank you very much.
First question for you.
Okay.
What ways did you find inside and outside work to renew and refresh yourself during the hard times of sacrificing your self-interest to do good of the team?
Well, my go-to is family, as it must be for a lot of other people. I'm lucky and blessed enough to have two beautiful girls and an amazing wife and a mother-in-law that was living with us, and it was good. She helped us so much, and we all had a very a mutually loving, relationship. And so, that's my escape. I mean, coming home, it's hard to do. It's hard to think about work, and so they ground you and they kind of reset you really quick, whether you like it or not. So that's my go-to.
Okay. Another question: do you have designers in different locations? And if yes, how do you build and maintain the human connection?
You know what? I don't know how this happened, but I'm the only director in apps that has every single person on their team in the building.
Huh?
So I feel a little guilty about it because my counterparts, so one of my counterparts, Chloe, she oversees the docs and editors team, and they're in New York, but then she has the drive team, which is they're half New York and in Boulder. And then Allie, my counterpart that oversees meeting solutions, she has Zurich and Kirkland, Washington, and Boulder, and New York, and so she's Stockholm too, so she's super spread out. So personally, I can't speak from personal experience, but from my observations working with amazing people like Chloe and Allie and Margaret, is that they travel quite a bit, and it's important to have that FaceTime with them, and so it's a bit of a tax, on the leaders, but I think it's an important one that you need to pay. And so they also leverage some technology like the meetings, regular Pulse meetings over GVC. We call it GVC, it's Google Voice Video Conferencing. And so there's a fair amount of check-in and touch points that way, but also you could have people come to you. And so we have regular summits that gives people opportunities and other ways to kind of get together and see each other's faces. And it's not necessarily even about doing work, but just, hang time and getting to know each other as people.
Excellent. Last question. Thank you for sharing your story. How do you stay yourself when working for a big company like Google?
Well, it feels still new, to be honest. And again, I think my first instinct was to try to catch up to all these people that are so smart and so well-versed in all the product and the technology. But I was running up against a wall there. And so it actually took a couple of conversations with my VP, Amy, to kind of shake me out of that mindset, because I think it's a fitting in or trying to fit in. It seems like just an easy thing to do, from a cognitive perspective, and from an emotional place, it's oddly feels safe to just go back to that because it's familiar. But I think just remembering that we have our own unique strengths that we can bring to the table, that diversity of thought, that different perspective is actually something that people, your teammates, even though they're dug in, they want that, they need that, even though they might not articulate it. And so that's remembering that that's a major reason why that you were brought in, I think helped me feel okay about putting myself out there a little bit.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Frank.